Okay. Hi, my name is Maria Krupina. I am faculty at the Division of Global Pediatrics, and my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katherine Yun, who will be talking today. And Katherine is the assistant professor at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. She did her MD in Harvard and her residency in Yale University. She also got her fellowship in the health and policy. And she is definitely a leading expert on refugee health and immigrant children health. I had a pleasure to be in the conference together with Katherine, and I learned a lot. I really looking forward to hear about what she will be talking today, and I will not wait and let her to talk to us, you guys. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that welcome. It's really nice to be here today. I have learned so much from folks in Minnesota in public health and in pediatrics and infectious disease here, so it's really an honor. And we're going to talk today about how refugees can be supported in the United States. What can we do as pediatricians to help refugee children and their families? I have nothing to disclose. I also have a soft voice. I think I'm well mic'd at this point, but if it's too loud or I'm too soft, just raise your hand and let me know. And so today's going to be a little bit different from some of my usual talks. I met with some residents last night, and Dr. Howard told me in advance, they've already learned so much from the experts here about medical screening. Try to talk to them about more advanced topics. And we sat down and they shared their stories, and I thought, oh yes, we're sort of at Refugee 2.0 or Refugee 3.0 level already here. So I'm not going to be talking about medical screening. Instead, I'm going to be talking about some things I learned along the way from other experts, from my patients and their families, about how we can really contextualize the current global refugee crisis. And we're going to talk about 4 myths and misperceptions, how we can partner with communities and with families to support children, and then how we as pediatricians can advocate both locally and nationally for kids. And so I'm going to start with the big picture. And unfortunately, the big picture is very, very big. So there are 60 million individuals around the world who are displaced by conflict. And 60 million is a hard number for me to head around, especially because half of that 60 million are children. When we think about that number, to make it a little bit more real, if all of those folks were from one country, that would be the 24th largest nation in the world. To make it a little more local, that's the entire population of the state of California plus all of its contiguous states. Or to become even more local, that's, I believe, more than 10 times the entire population of Minnesota. So if you were to take all of the children in Minnesota 10 times over, this is how many children who have been affected by displacement. Now, despite that, when we look at the news, we might imagine everyone in that 60 million is fleeing their homes right now, and everyone in that 60 million is on their way to Europe. And that's actually a little bit of a misperception. So in reality, if we were to break down those numbers even further, over half of that 60 million are people who are still inside their country of origin. Those are people who are internally displaced. They're also called IDPs. And so they are still benefiting from the protections, hopefully, of their national government, but there might be a civil war, a natural disaster, or another conflict that's forced them to leave behind their homes. Sometimes they're living in a very, very transient setting. Sometimes they're living in a more stable setting. And when we look at our large populations of individuals, we have a large number from Syria, from Iraq, from Colombia, from Sudan, and from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so much of the burden of caring for people who've been displaced by conflict still rests with those home governments. If we want to think just about refugees, we're talking about people who are outside of their country of origin. And there's about 15 million refugees worldwide. In the United States, we have refugees coming here from over 36 different countries. But right now, just a couple places account for the majority of that population. And so as you can imagine, we have Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. And I know you guys are taking care of a lot of folks from Somalia here in Minnesota. Not only are they outside of their country of origin, but they're unable to return because of fear, and it's fear of persecution. That persecution is usually on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And so when refugees are found to have met that definition, they might be in a refugee camp, they might be in a city, usually in a country adjacent to where they come from. They typically wait, and they wait, and they wait, and eventually they go through a screening process that allows them to come to the U.S. through a formal resettlement program. That includes security clearances. It also includes health care and overseas medical exam before coming here, which is partnered with a domestic medical exam once people arrive. So myth number 2 is that we're in the midst of an unprecedented refugee crisis. And this one is a little bit nuanced. So we're certainly living through a period of time where there's been a steep acceleration in the number of people who are displaced. And this is for 2014, the number of people who are displaced each day because of conflict. So that's larger than a number of major U.S. college campuses right there. And you can see that that number has been increasing steadily over the past 5 years. But to put that in a little bit of broader context, the overall number of displaced has been high for many, many years. And in fact, if we go back all the way to the year 2000, the number of displaced has been between 40 and 50 million people almost every year. So what we're looking at right now is an acute exacerbation of a chronic crisis. This is more akin to climate change, something we know we need to deal with, something that's getting worse, something that's not going to go away immediately, but it's not something that came out of nowhere. We've been working with displaced populations for a long time. The other thing you can see when you look at this graphic, and this is showing us refugees and asylum seekers, this is showing us internally displaced people here in green, and this little red line is showing the number of newly displaced. And the number of newly displaced individuals is actually an important and a significant, but a relatively low proportion of the overall number of displaced. And the reason that is because a lot of people who are displaced for a long time. They might be displaced for generations or even decades. And there's a lot that we as pediatricians are going to learn and going to think about from both groups. So I don't know, did anyone see on John Oliver's show or in the news a story about this girl? So this is a little girl from Syria. She's in a wheelchair. She probably has a congenital condition that's caused her to have difficulty to walk. And she was from a very active conflict zone. She left that conflict zone with her sister and with a family, so leaving part of her family behind, and went by boat, by land, and by bus from Syria to Germany. She sort of gained fame after being profiled by a number of news services because of her optimism in the face of what was a very difficult journey for her, coming from very difficult circumstances. And when we think about newly displaced children like her, there are a couple of things that we're thinking about. Quite often, like her, they might have been separated from family members. They might have had acute experiences with trauma. So that could be exposure to traumatic events. It could be witnessing traumatic events, as you might find in a conflict zone. She left home with a wheelchair and a backpack. And so any medical equipment or medical records that she had from her country of origin was really unlikely to follow with her. And so when she arrives in Germany, she has arrived in Germany, one of the things her health care providers are going to do is they're going to be rebuilding that medical record along with her and her family. In contrast, when we are thinking about individuals who've been displaced for a long time, they might have some different social circumstances. And so this is a photo from a nonprofit called the Dobbs Stories. And they're a media-based nonprofit that do video and arts work in a camp in Kenya in East Africa that's been there since 1991. And this is one of the largest refugee camps in the world. There are about 300,000 people who've been living in this complex. And some of them have been living there for so long that not only have children been born in this camp, but there are actually grandchildren of some of the original camp residents who've been living there. And so when you look at this photo in contrast, What we're seeing from a photo inside the camp is actually a picture of a market scene, and you can see that there's sort of an established commercial and economic enterprises, things that are developing that are more similar to what you would see in a semi-permanent encampment or even a small city. When we have children who are coming from these protracted situations, often, again, they've been born in the country where their parents have sought refuge. They might have never even set foot in the country they're originally from. And in fact, they might be what we call stateless. So as refugees, they weren't granted citizenship in the country where they've been given refuge. But because their parents can't register their birth in their home country, they don't have the rights and privileges of citizenship there either. And so they end up being unprotected. When we are resettling children in the United States, in recent years, many children who we see have actually come from these protracted situations. And so those have been children from ethnic minorities in Burma, from the Nepali-speaking minority in Bhutan, children from Iraq, children from Somalia, as you guys see here. And there are also a large number of children from the DRC who've, again, been in that situation of protracted displacement. So there are some things that are going to be different, again, about that social setting. So this is somewhere where you might have a camp that's been in place for decades. That means a child is more likely to have been able to attend school. In contrast, there are over 2 million children in Syria who are out of school, and children who are in flight from that situation are less likely to have easily arrived in a place where they're going to be integrated into education. You might also have families that are semi-intact. So again, if your parents were born in a refugee camp, they're going to be suffering, often from social deprivation, from economic deprivation, and from some of the challenges that come from being in a camp setting. But your parents were born in the refugee camp. That means your parents are both there with you. Possibly their parents are also there as well. And so for children, having a stable education, having an intact family, and even an intact extended family can be real assets then when they resettle in the United States. There are challenges that can go along with that as well. Some communities will talk about being unprepared for life in the United States, where you need to be self-sufficient. If you've been in a camp where you've been forced to be dependent upon government aid or nonprofit aid for a long period of time. But again, there are assets and there are challenges for kids coming from both. The third myth that I want to tackle is that refugees are broken. And I think it's easy if you just watch the news or you look at media reports. There are some very compelling stories. There are some very sad stories. And those stories are real, and I don't want to minimize those difficulties. But the truth is that people are incredibly resilient, and people also recover with time. And so these are some data that we looked at. This was from a national survey that was done in 2003 with people who just got their green cards. And it included about 500 people who'd come to the U.S. as refugees or asylees. And it asked them about their experiences with persecution. And so you can see 47%, about half of them, said that they or someone in their immediate family had specifically been harmed by persecution. And remember, some people were threatened. Some people were at risk, but they might not have been harmed before fleeing their home country, before receiving protection. But if we just focus on those people who were harmed, who were persecuted, you can see that, first of all, the types of persecution that they suffered were often quite severe. So about 30% of people had either been incarcerated or had an immediate relative who'd been incarcerated. Nearly 50% had been physically abused by representatives of their home government. About 30% to 40% had been physically abused by someone else. And of course, many other people had been threatened, had their property damaged, lost their job, or had lost their property on account of their membership in that national, ethnic, religious, political, or other social group. And people also endorsed a lot of different kinds of harm. So it wasn't as if one thing happened to you and everything else you were sort of okay. You can see that actually a third of the people who said they had been harmed by persecution reported 5, 6, or even 7 different kinds of persecution and harm. So that's a pretty heavy burden people are coming to you with. On the other hand, in the same survey, people were asked about symptoms of major depression, and they used an established instrument that's often used in international research with folks who are at risk for major depression, using a cut point that usually detected about 80% of cases. So when people crossed that threshold, you felt about 80% confident that they probably did in fact have clinical depression. And these are folks who've now been in the US at least a year, often many years, so time has passed. And if we just look at the ones who had, again, experienced that persecution, experienced that harm, only 9% were endorsing those symptoms of depression by that time. If we look at individuals who said they hadn't been harmed, but they were at risk, they'd been threatened, they'd had to leave, 4% were endorsing those symptoms. And so people recover. People do well. People need support for that, but they certainly get there. And there's a lot of resilience research with kids from all different kinds of contexts, child soldiers, survivors of natural disasters, and refugees themselves that shows that this is the case. The final myth, and this one is related, is that refugees are destitute and they no longer have anything to contribute to society. And I think, unfortunately, we're hearing that a lot. You know, these messages about people who are coming either to Europe or to the US and are, taking up resources and have so many needs. And yes, people do need support. But people also bring incredible diversity and incredible richness to our society. And so if we think about just a few people who are refugees and who've made a big impact, Madeleine Albright, she was actually not a refugee once, she was a refugee twice, once during World War II and once again during political problems in Czechoslovakia when she was a young girl. We can think about Valentino Deng, who is now the executive director of a foundation that builds schools back in his home country of Sudan. But he had been forced to flee his home. His father was a shopkeeper. They had a stable life situation. And then he actually had to travel mostly on foot to Ethiopia and then Kenya, where he lived for decades before coming here. And then his biography was written up by Dave Eggers in this book, What is the What? And there are individuals like G.B. Tran, who I really recommend you get his book. He's actually the child of refugees. So his family came to the U.S. from Vietnam, and he ended up profiling that journey, both for his family in Vietnam and then for his family in the U.S., and what it was like for him as the child of refugees, what it was like for his brothers and sisters, in this wonderful graphic novel called Vietnam America. We don't have any formal survey on how many healthcare providers are refugees or children of refugees, but every time I go to a talk and I ask people, hands go up in the air. Or when I meet people, when I meet residents and I ask them why they're interested in healthcare for immigrants, they might share that story. So we know there's also been a lot of contributions to healthcare. And we can look at the data, and the data are going to show us the same thing. And so this is an analysis of U.S. Census data that was done by the Migration Policy Institute. And they looked at the census data, and they wanted to look at educational attainment for refugees. And I'm just showing you a little slice of this. But this is folks who have a bachelor's degree or another advanced degree. And they broke this down by gender, which makes sense. And they broke this down by country of origin. And they compared it to non-immigrant American adults. And so here, this white bar here is sort of our, say, general population norm, the proportion of people who have a bachelor's degree or higher. And what I want to draw your eye to is that there are some refugee populations that actually have a higher level of educational attainment overall than the U.S. population. There are refugee populations where that's not the case, and there are certainly populations where there's differences between men and women. But again, refugees are diverse, and they're coming to us not just with need for support, but also with these assets. Another way to think about this is if we look at median household income over time. So when people first come to the United States, even if they have, for example, completed their higher education, they might still need to recertify, they might still need to work on their English. And so when folks first come here, this is showing refugees' median household income relative to non-refugee households. So that's the comparison. This is as a percentage of non-refugee households. Individuals who've been here for less than 5 years, a lower proportion of them, their median household income is certainly lower than the non-refugee median household income. But what we see over time, this is less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and 10 to 20 years. What we see over time is that steady progression, going from 42% to 66% to 87%. So again, getting closer and closer to that U.S. median. And I always like to talk about healthcare. And I wish we knew how many pediatricians were refugees or the child of refugees. I'm not going to ask you guys to identify yourselves, but if anyone wants to share a story or has a question that pertains to this when we get to that, to the end, I really welcome you to do so. But we do at least have data on young pediatricians in the U.S., and so these are folks who finished residency in the last decade, and how many of them are immigrants or the children of immigrants. And I love this graph. What we can see is that overall, the white bars, 22%, so nearly 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 young pediatricians was actually born outside the U.S. And 40% of young pediatricians have at least one parent who is born outside of the U.S. We can see a lot of variation. We've got different racial and ethnic groups across these different colors. As we start looking, for example, at young Asian pediatricians, almost all of them have at least one parent who is born outside of the U.S. So immigrants are making a big contribution to medicine in this country, and I would hypothesize that refugees are making a big contribution as well. So if that's our broader social context, we have global migration, we have a chronic crisis with acute exacerbations, we have children coming from really diverse social settings, some of which have just been forced to flee their homes, some of which might have been born in refugee camps, had their parents born in refugee camps. What is our role? What can we do as pediatricians in promoting their integration and their well-being here in the United States? I do not have all of the answers, but I am going to share some things with you that I've learned from other people that I think have been helpful for me in framing my work, both with my patients, with my families, and with the community. And I think the first key principle is to give children time. And so again, the research that's been done on resilience, that's been done in many different populations, first of all tells us that most children are going to be well. And so that work has often, it's an emerging area, but it has often shown that 80 to 90% of kids are either in a stress-resistant space, meaning their family supports, their social context, that dynamic interplay that surrounded them even during this trauma in their life was such that they were not experiencing symptoms of psychopathology. They were attaining those positive social and developmental milestones, and they're going to continue in that positive space even after resettlement. That's about 40% of kids, let's say. Another 40% were impacted. And how can they not be, right? Again, I think it's important to remember when people have a negative response to a negative life experience, they're not broken, they're human, right? And so we have another 40% of kids who maybe their social emotional state was not all that it could be, but then they arrive in a situation of safety, and hopefully in the U.S. what we're offering them is a situation of safety with stable adult attachments with their parents, with their families, and you're going to see recovery over time. A much smaller percentage of kids are the children who we worry about, who aren't either making that recovery or who even after arriving in a situation where they should be saved, continue to decompensate and continue to struggle. And so I think our role as pediatricians, people often ask me, well, how do I know? I want to meet this kid and I want to know what's going to happen to them. What do they need? First, yes, keep that in mind, not just for the child, but also for their parent. Pay attention to the social cues in the room, but also repeated, sustained contact, a longitudinal relationship is necessary because it's going to take time to know which kids are going in which direction. And it's probably going to take time before kids and their parents are going to feel comfortable enough with you that they're going to share some of the struggles if they're sort of arriving into this space. I think the other thing, and this should be no surprise after talking about that, is it is incredibly important that we support parents and families. And so, again, that same body of resilience research has shared that the severity of trauma matters, the acuteness of the trauma matters, so as time passes, people recover. But the most important thing is that children have a secure, safe adult attachment. And this goes back as far as World War II, when folks who worked with children who'd been through the Blitz, through those bombings, would make observations about how well children seem to be, even if they'd gone through a bombing, as long as their parents were by their side. That was an unusual life situation, but it could be as unusual as the first day you took the bus or the first day you went to the countryside. That adult attachment really matters. I think as pediatricians, we do a good job thinking about families, but I think sometimes we aren't prepared to fully commit to programs or fully advocate for programs that are really primarily supporting parents. And I don't mean parenting classes, I don't mean teaching people how to be better parents, because often people are excellent parents. I mean making sure that parents themselves have the things that they need to be healthy, that they need to provide that anchor for their kids. So are they themselves getting health care? Are they themselves struggling with access to mental health care? Are they thinking about their job prospects? Are they learning English? Economically, do they feel safe and stable? All of those things are going to have a huge impact on kids. And kids and families live in communities. With forced displacement, one of the things that often happens is you lose that network of support that many of us take for granted, right? I don't know if my kid is sick or not. I'm going to call my friend who's got a kid about the same age. Or, oh my gosh, I'm running late. Someone's got to go, make sure that the kids got home okay, that the bus dropped them off. So all of these people who we can take for granted, that give us not only instrumental help, but also a sense of safety and stability ourselves, those things are often lost. Even if you came from a camp where you had an intact community, when you resettle in the U.S., as you guys know, families can be dispersed across many different states, communities can be dispersed, and it takes time to rebuild. Helping to rebuild those communities can be incredibly helpful, not only because it supports parents, but also because it supports kids. As a couple examples, in Philadelphia, I work with the Bhutanese community. And so they themselves, this refugee community, without any funding, while still working through that early challenge of resettlement in the United States, started a nonprofit organization where they could provide mutual support for each other. It provides a haven for people in the community who are still learning English so they can communicate freely with someone else in their own language. And they take people who are bilingual, who have those advanced degrees that I showed you before, and who have experience working in the United States, and they really provide what we call navigation support. So how do things work in the US? How can I get the things done that I need to get done in the US? And how can I learn those things? Because it's one thing if your doctor says, you need to see ENT, I'm going to give you the phone number, can you call? Usually in the room, the family's like, okay. But in reality, they want someone else who's lived through it, who's from their community, who can coach them through that process, who might be there in the room with them when they make a phone call for the first time, who can explain what's going to happen, to give them the confidence then to become more self-sufficient themselves. And so in terms of supporting parents, communities are often incredibly, incredibly helpful. Communities also support kids. And so we think a lot about acculturation when we're thinking about young people, and we're going to talk about that. And one of the things that young people often benefit from is if they still have a strong attachment to their home culture. Going somewhere new and leaving everything behind that you grew up with, rejecting your parents' culture, can create a lot of conflict for families, and it can create problems for kids. When you have a strong community that's continued to celebrate your language, continued to celebrate your cultural traditions, it can again help children create a stable dual or hyphenated identity here in the United States. Another key, I think, for us, all of us, is combating racism and bigotry. And so there's a lot of attention to the traumatic experiences that kids have before they come here. It's really easy for people to say, you lived through a war, oh my gosh, that must be terrible. But there's actually quite a bit of work that shows that the traumatic experiences here in the US are just as influential when we're thinking about children's long-term outcomes and their long-term well-being. And being rejected in the US, suffering from racial discrimination or religious bigotry in the United States has a very meaningful impact on kids. Folks have studied this for years, and I think this quote from Alejandro Portes and Ruben Rimbaud, who are two leading sociologists on the well-being of immigrant children and their families, to me really brings everything home. And so they note that there are groups that are slated for a smooth transition into the mainstream, and for whom ethnicity will soon be a matter of choice. They will identify with their ancestry on occasion and when convenient. There are others for whom ethnicity will be a source of strength and who will muscle their way up socially and economically on the basis of their own community's networks and resources. Again, those communities are important. That can be like the alumni network that you need to get ahead in the US. There are still others whose ethnicity will be neither a matter of choice nor a source of progress, but a mark of subordination. And that's our deficiency as a society. That's a failing that we have and we continue to have. And refugee children might be coming into that situation here. I certainly do not have the answers in how we can make things better for kids. I do think that if you work in an immigrant or refugee health space, it does make you a natural ally for others in pediatrics who are working on anti-racist initiatives, who are working on diversity initiatives, and who are really paying attention to those problems. And I think that, again, ties into acculturation. So children are trying to navigate what folks have called hyphenated identities here in the United States. And the old model for thinking about that is that, this was a linear relationship. And you could either be all the way at one end where you were embracing your home culture, or you could be all the way at the other end where you were embracing culture in the US. And kids had to find the right place on that line. What we've actually learned is that relationships with culture are what people will call orthogonal. And that means you have multiple cultures that can all operate together. You're not making a choice. And there's some great research showing that we're not just talking about two cultures. Sometimes people will have 3 or even 4 identities that they're navigating. One might be ethnic, one might be national, one might be religious, and one might be identity here in the United States. And children will actually navigate that in many different ways. So you can have a child, for example, this little blue cartoon here, this quadrilateral is showing us someone who's got both a strong home culture and that strong US culture. In contrast, you can have kids who are actually like this purple figure over on this cartoon who have both a weak affiliation with US culture, but also a weak affiliation with their home culture. And you can imagine that is very, very challenging for kids in that place. That is a very isolating space. People try not to make value judgments, what is the right fit for kids, but it does seem to be the case that, again, when you can navigate that hyphenated identity, when you feel like you can strongly affiliate with both, for young people that has a lot of advantages, right? They're in social situations like school, we're navigating that US culture is really important, but they also, again, they need to have that connection to their families for resilience, for recovery, just, for childhood stuff. We're often having a strong relationship to the home culture is beneficial. And because when we're talking about acculturation in kids, we're not just thinking about kids. We're also thinking about kids in the context of a parent. And so I'm guessing some of you have seen a situation where a child, they're like, I'm not even young enough anymore. I'm going to say all the things that aren't cool. I guess they'd be on Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram and doing things like that with their friends. And their parents have not acculturated with the US. And sometimes that can be a source of conflict. And so often when parents and children are both moving along these axes together, they are most successful as a family when they both have opportunities to affiliate with the US, when they both have opportunities to retain that pride in their country of origin, in their culture of origin. And I think, again, by supporting communities, we support that. And I think we also send signals to families when we're with them in the office. Do we ask them any words in their home language? Do we congratulate them when they're continuing to study both Nepali and their English is improving? What are the subtle signals we send that it's actually good to remain in touch with both? The final thing I want to say is don't forget about teens. And I think it's really easy for us in pediatrics to get really, really focused on little kids and to forget that things are going to be a little bit different as you get older. And when teens come to the U.S. as refugees, often it's a little bit of a different challenge. So there's a lot of work on immigrants coming to the U.S. that shows that around the age of 11, you're at a critical point. That's often, I don't know if any of you are from immigrant families, but if you have, for example, someone who came to the U.S. who was when they were 12 or 13 and younger siblings who came when they were 8 or 9, which child still has a little bit of an accent, which child had to work harder to learn English, often you'll see a big difference. as kids get older, they also have less time in school. And that can be really hard for them because schools, even in difficult school districts, are the best place for kids to learn English. So if you're put in 12th grade and you get 1 year and then you're headed out, helping those kids find resources like community colleges that have affordable English language programs that will help them with preparation for higher education can be absolutely key. Otherwise, kids are going to face a lot of pressure either to enter the workforce early or even to enter into marriages early. And so, again, those extra supports. We all know that teens have unique behavioral risk factors. When we meet with teens here in the U.S., one of the things we want to do is we want to introduce them to what's normal. So in a lot of places, it's not normal for a teenager to talk to the doctor alone. It's not normal to have that conversation about confidential subjects. Often introducing that both to the teen and to the parents, establishing that as a norm, saying it is something different, but it's something we do here, can be that first step to making sure you have an opening then to talk to that teen privately about some of those behaviors and risk factors to make sure that they're getting care when they need it and good advice. And we can't forget about teens' assets. They're creative, they're flexible, they're community and peer-oriented. So programming that incorporates teens, incorporates their preferences and their interests can often be very, very successful. And finally, I want to talk about advocacy. And so hopefully, one of the things that makes us good advocates is by being well informed. So knowing what the myths are, knowing how those misperceptions can be changed so we feel comfortable speaking out for refugees and refugee communities. And there are a couple ways that I think we need to do that in general. I think one of the most important things for us, since we are in healthcare, is to advocate for strong health systems. And why is this important for refugees in particular? Having, for example, bilingual health systems, which has been one solution people have had. Well, we have a large Spanish-speaking community. We don't need to worry about that, the big hospital. We'll just make a clinic where everyone speaks Spanish, and that's going to be an adequate solution. We have a large population who speaks Mandarin, so we're going to have a Chinese-speaking clinic, and that's going to fix the problem. But that's really not enough, right? So for refugees specifically, this is showing you in 1990, 2000, and 2010, the seven largest groups who came to the U.S. in 2010 and made up over 80% of resettled refugees. So in 2010, I might have said, I really need to have clinics where people speak Farsi, where they speak Spanish, where they speak Arabic, and maybe a few other languages. But if you had gone back just 10 years, you can see those same groups make up only about 20% of resettlement. So when we're advocating for refugees in the health system, we're not advocating for one specific group or one specific language. We're advocating for a health system that can meet the needs of families with limited English proficiency, no matter where they're from, no matter what language they speak, and no matter what part of the health system they're in. We're talking about primary care, tertiary care, mental health care, where there are huge challenges, and insurance access as well, right? Making sure that kids can get insured and they can get through the door and they can stay insured. And when we're being advocates for refugees in this way, we're also being advocates for children in general. So 1 in 4 U.S. children has at least one immigrant parent. If we look at the Latino and Asian communities, there's going to be 40%, in some cases, depending on where you are, or more of those children have at least one parent who has limited English proficiency. So we need to be stronger as a health system, not just for refugees, but also for kids overall. I also think we need to advocate for welcoming communities. I do not think it serves any of us well. It does not serve our refugee patients well, and it does not serve the rest of our patients well if we have communities that have embraced racism or bigotry. And so this is just a letter that was sent from the governor of Texas stating that, as governor of Texas, I write to inform you that the state of Texas will not accept any refugees from Syria. Can you imagine fleeing somewhere where you were being persecuted because of your political beliefs, because of your religious beliefs, and then being told that you were not wanted anywhere else either? I think this is incredibly damaging for kids. And I think we as a community have an obligation to speak out. I think we have an obligation to engage locally. So if you're invited to speak with a church, with a school, with another mainstream organization that may not be as comfortable with immigrants and refugees but want to learn, say yes. Saying no is the last resort. Say yes. When you have opportunities to engage with refugee communities, and so a number of refugee communities in Philadelphia in honor of Martin Luther King Day actually did a street cleanup down in South Philadelphia, and they invited people from all over the city to participate along with them. So what a wonderful opportunity for refugee communities and mainstream communities to spend time together, to engage in service together. And speak out in social media. If you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook even, make sure that people know that you think refugees are welcome. Because the more people who share that sentiment, the more it becomes clear that we as a nation are a welcoming people, and that we do want to create a space that's open to religious diversity, that's open to ethnic and national diversity. And of course, advocate for funding for refugee services. And so this is a little cartoon that's just showing funding levels for refugee resettlement from 1990 to the present. And most years, things were at about $400 million. Things have recently increased. And that sounds like a lot of money, but we resettle between 60 to 80,000 individuals in the U.S. each year. For them to be successful, they need to learn English, they need case management to get connected with services, children need to get into preschool, they need to get into school, parents need to recertify or get ready for jobs, and we need to make sure that we're providing adequate health care. It's, in my opinion, quite likely that we spend far, far too little on these programs because, again, the stronger families are, the better an introduction we give them to the U.S. in the beginning, the more likely those children are to go on to be successful, to go on to have recovery from those traumatic experiences. And so making sure that there's enough for extended case management, making sure that there's enough for emergencies, for changes, for unexpected inflows, and making sure that there are ways for us to support populations we might not have worked with before, like young people from Syria who are going to be a new population for our country, I think is absolutely critical. Speaking out again with your elected officials, both locally and in DC, makes a difference. People hear over and over about saving money, but people also need to hear that we need to invest in kids in order to give them the best possible start here. So with that, I'm going to just thank you guys for your attention, welcome your questions, your stories, anything you'd like to share, and show a few resources that I think have been helpful as I've worked with refugee families here in the U.S. Thank you all. Can I poll informally? And if you're not comfortable, you don't have to raise your hand. But I'm wondering, are there any folks here who either came to us as refugees or the children of refugees or the grandchildren of refugees? Okay. What about, yeah, there's always a handful of people. Great. And what about folks who came to the U.S. as immigrants, the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants? Yeah. And then we have a lot of hands go up. Or spouses, exactly. Yep. Spouses of immigrants. Great.
Okay, what do you like about working in this population specifically? And what do you find most challenging?
So the question is, what do I like about working with this population and what do I find most challenging? I really feel like I told you guys before, I don't have all the answers. This is the kind of work you do where you're constantly learning. And I think for me, it's been a real privilege as I work with different refugee populations to learn about different cultures, to learn about different experiences both overseas and in coming to the U.S. I've personally also found it very inspirational to work with refugee communities who are really coming together in that spirit of mutual assistance and help. So to see what communities themselves are doing to help folks be successful in the U.S., it always makes you realize your own problems are not that big. I think the most challenging thing, I think the most frustrating thing is access to mental health care. I think knowing that even though most children are doing well, you do have some children who really do have acute needs, and you do not always have facilities that feel comfortable working with children who don't yet speak English in a way that's meaningful, in a way that's helpful to them, is personally very, very frustrating. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was interested in your depression scale stuff, but have they done that similarly with PTSD?
So there is. That's a wonderful question. There is similar work from PTSD, and there are a lot of folks. Mina Fazel, for example, at Oxford, has done a series of really excellent literature reviews, both on the pediatric and the adult literature, looking at the prevalence of depression and PTSD amongst refugees who are resettled in high and medium income countries, as well as factors that promote resilience and factors that don't. And I think what's most interesting about her work is when she pulled together the largest studies, so studies that were community or population level, not just clinic-specific studies. For depression, for example, the incidence, the prevalence really is very similar to that of the general population. It was actually about 5% overall. PTSD, it's a bit higher, closer to 10%, but still not as high as I think people often imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question to follow on that you said it's a challenge. We don't have enough mental health providers.
Mm-hmm.
Given that you work so closely with families, what do you see as a solution to train more people who know native language, or you think we are talking about more interpreters involved?
I think we need two approaches. One thing I often see when I work directly with refugee communities, again, I think, if you go back to this slide, we'll scroll all the way back, it's worth it. So there are a lot of folks who come to the U.S. with higher education, who might have been in a health field, even if it wasn't mental health, or who might have social work experience from spending so much time doing case management with their own communities. And we do not have a way to fast track those folks into mental health care as professionals. So you could have someone who's basically been doing social work with a refugee community who's bilingual, bicultural, from that community for years. But for them to recertify in the U.S. might be impossible for them and their family, just the amount of debt that's required to go back to school, the time off from working. And I think big picture, if I was in charge of mental health policy, I would want to think about solutions to fast track folks who would be bilingual, bicultural mental health professionals here in the U.S. But I also think we need to, just like we need to in our regular pediatric systems, we need to provide better training in working with interpreters. We need to provide better support and training for our interpreters. So I was just with an interpreter the other day, and she was wonderful, and we were having a really great encounter. But she was experiencing trauma and hearing about this family's experience in going through war. Because I think it was a very personal story that might have been similar to her own story. So we need to provide support for our interpreters, and I think we need to be real champions for our colleagues in mental health care who are trying to introduce more services for folks who have limited English proficiency, to make sure that we're joining them when they try to convince other people that it's important. I have not been able to find national data on the number of child mental health providers who are comfortable either working with an interpreter or working in another language. I think just the fact that there's not that data, as far as I've been able to find, is in and of itself significant.
I guess I'm your plant. So do you want to comment just a little bit on, my experience is that even in medical school level and residency, the training around the issues that you've discussed today, I think, is lacking to a certain extent. But also the training around medical and I guess geographic and ethnic differences in disease. For example, I can tell you still in our medical school curriculum, there's a lot more on cystic fibrosis than there is on schistosomiasis. And 80% of our Somalis are schistosomiasis seropositive, which is over, that's probably 50,000 people, and they get probably 20 minutes on that topic.
So, this is a tough one. I think first in that piece about culture, I have really been inspired by the work that's been done on cultural humility. So I do not think nursing or medical school is where you can go to learn sort of a checklist of characteristics about people from a certain place. And I think you guys share that in talking to the residents last night. It was very clear that they had that same message, in part because you have to always see everyone as an individual. So we can inadvertently stereotype people. And in part because the world is a big place and we need to be constantly learning from folks from different places. The content of the medical school curriculum in terms of specific disease processes, you know, that's a real challenge. Because on the one hand, you do want to make sure that people are well prepared to see the majority of their patients. And even in pediatric immigrant health, the majority of kids have immigrant parents but are born in the U.S. themselves. So I have to admit to you, I don't know that I have the right answer to that question. Are there things that you've seen that have been successful?
No, I just think that our medical system, if you look at like time to define best practices in business, in the business world, to implementation, it's somewhere between 6 and 8 months. And if you look at it in medical practice, it's between 12 and 13 years.
Yeah.
And I would say if you look at the populations that are being served in any community and the amount of resources that go into teaching do not necessarily match the needs of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's often even true if we don't look at immigrants. There's been some interesting work looking at, for example, NIH spending on sickle cell in comparison to cystic fibrosis and whether there's equity there. So, yeah, we're a little bit slow. I think there are some technological solutions. There have, been some online platforms you've shown me, in fact, to help people get access to information a little bit more quickly if they haven't had the training previously. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your questions.